Well, hello everyone, and welcome once again to another installment in our lecture series on the French Revolution. This one will trace now the constitutional monarchy, the rise and fall of the constitutional monarchy from 1789 to 1792. Um, so once the once the Third Estate ceases to meet and it begins to draw up a new constitution for France, that constitution consists of a monarch and a unicameral legislature. So the legislature, one body, one chamber, meets together as let's say a single House of Commons, or as if it was just the United States House of Representatives. There's no two bodies that vote back and forth. One unicameral legislature which has war powers, and the monarch now has a veto on legislations, but it's a suspensive veto. In other words, he can hold up legislation, but if there's enough support for it, or if in the next parliament that or the next legislature that same issue is brought up and confirmed, then that's the way in which that veto can be overridden. Other political issues during this time are going to be the Declaration of the Rights of Women. Olympe de Gouges says, okay, we have this Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. What about the Declaration of the Rights of Women? So we already see voices that are saying, wait a minute, hold on now. If we really believe in all these ideals, in a new France, in a new politics, in a new way of doing things, what about the other half of the population? Okay? Mary Wollstonecraft will write her famous vindication of de Gauche's Declaration of the Rights of Women. Some of the policies of the new government, all about making things more rational, breaking down the sort of the traditionalism that's a holdover from the Middle Ages. So instead of these traditional provinces that were the result of the rise of feudalism in early medieval France, they're broken down into nearly equal-sized departments throughout France. Royal courts are abolished, and a new court system is organized. Workers' unions are banned. Okay, so they're trying to fend off. This particular government is trying to fend off um, sort of more liberal or more radical voices of of the lower classes, of the working classes. Remember, this is the revolution of kind of the liberal, the solidly liberal middle class, and we could say even the upper middle class. They want political rights. They're not necessarily, and they're into equality, but that does not necessarily mean that they're advocating specifically for the rights of the poor or the working class. Okay? Certain types of taxes were abolished, particularly indirect taxes, ways in which the government could get funding through fees and such. And probably one of the most controversial issues was the issuance of assignats, or assignat, which were government bonds. It was essentially a kind of currency that were used to pay down the debt. They liquidated it, they turned the debt into cash, um, and it leads to significant inflation because it's essentially it's a step away from the gold standard. That although we wouldn't, the term gold standard is a little bit anachronistic. It's not appropriate for this time, but it's essentially how European governments functioned. Everything was related to the value of gold, or the value of gold in coinage. This is a paper currency essentially, and like most paper currencies, except in Britain, paper currency can actually be quite controversial. Okay? And we can see here the territories, the departments. These are the old territories, the traditional duchies of France and counties, and here are the new, smaller departments. Religiously, um, the revolutionaries are very suspicious of the church. They believe that the church is always out to support the monarchy because of that close relationship between church and state that developed in France over the centuries. So they confiscate much of church land. They redistribute that church land. They use it for government purposes. They develop a law called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, in which the church becomes a branch of the secular government. Clergy are now employees of the government. They are paid to the government, paid by the government, and they are actually asked to swear an oath of allegiance to the French state. This means that the ties to Rome, the ties to the Pope as the leadership of the Catholic Church in France, are being loosened, and there are many um, clergymen um, who disagree with this. Only 7 bishops and half of the priests agreed with the legislation, and they're probably going to be poorer priests who feel that they're really not being compensated well enough, or their diocese or their parish is being overlooked. Um, the remainder of them sort of join the official, shall we say, opposition to the revolution's excesses. This is not a political policy. This is a religious policy. Um, it shows a particular axe to grind that the revolutionaries have against the church, and so the group called the refractory clergy develop, and they will be a significant source, especially among women in France, for opposition to revolutionary policies. And that brings us to the whole idea of a counter-revolution, to turn back the forces that have been unleashed by the storming of the Bastille and the meeting of the estates. Folks who did not like the revolution, or who were nobles who could have been targeted by the revolution, begin to move outside of France. They're called émigrés. They move to other countries. They have connections around Europe. They go there and they advocate in foreign courts, foreign governments, for intervention in the French Revolution, to stir up support internationally for the French monarchy. At the same time, Louis XVI attempts to escape France, the so-called flight to Varennes, in which he tries to get to the Belgian border. What's modern-day Belgium was then controlled by Austria and was therefore friendly territory because Marie Antoinette was Austrian. The idea was essentially that you could get the king and queen and the royal family out of France, and then they could, from outside of France, lead an army, or lead a military force of international troops that could then restore order in France. Um, this does not work. This is probably one of the most disastrous moves of Louis XVI. He is recognized on his way to Varennes. Um, the revolutionaries basically bring him back and put him under house arrest. Then you do have foreign intervention. The Prussians, a very powerful state in Europe at the time, under their general, the Duke of Brunswick, issued the so-called Declaration of Pillnitz, which says in August of 1791, if anything bad happens to the king and queen, then there will be significant repercussions when the Prussians enter Paris. Well, this just trips the wire in France, right? It seems like, oh, okay, so the king is colluding with foreign powers, essentially. And those foreign powers are designed to, are plotting to do great harm to France. So the constitutional monarchy was fully in place by the autumn of 1791, and the Legislative Assembly, though, begins to fear that there is an aristocratic encirclement, that the king is sort of has a constitutional duty. Aristocrats are outside of France. They are advocating for the king, and this is all problematic. This is a middle path that's unsustainable specifically because of the external pressure on the French government at this time. And so we'll see that the response to this counter-revolutionary movement is going to be the revolutionaries raising the bar and becoming and radicalizing themselves in what's called the Reign of Terror, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. But for the time being, it's a question of, do we still keep this king that appears to be, for all intents and purposes, plotting to overthrow the government. The Legislative Assembly had started to meet as I said, in the autumn of 1791. One group that emerges is called the Jacobins. They are They are more radical than some of the earlier revolutionaries that met at Versailles in 1789. They draw their ideology from the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the concept of the popular will, um, the will of the people. They believe in equality, a more radical notion of equality, of popular sovereignty, and of being virtuous democratic citizens or republican citizens. They call for a new push for the republic, and they get their name, by the way. I should mention this because they met in an old Jacobite or Jacobin um, monastery that was in Paris. That was their meeting hall. One faction in this more radical group, the Girondists, and the other Jacobins will eventually split. But the Girondists get their name. They came from a particular region of France called the Gironde. They want war with Austria. They figure that the way you can galvanize support for the um, for the more liberal elements in the French Revolution, uh, and even for a republic, is to actually show that the government is actively fighting against the adversaries. And it's a way to stir up patriotism and national spirit to defend France, but not necessarily to defend the king. They're making this distinction between being loyal to the king and being loyal to France, and they're actively encouraging the latter. The war with Austria and Prussia are not necessarily going very well. People are, at first, people are not very happy with things. People are getting paranoid. Um, in the summer of 1792, there are Parisian mobs attack the Tuileries. They feel, or the rumors have gotten out, that it's actually Louis that's behind this foreign invasion, and Marie Antoinette especially. Um, his royal bodyguard is killed, and the only place the king can go to seek any kind of refuge is the legislative assembly. He abdicates his powers. The king can't even defend himself. And so the assembly says, well, if you're coming to us for protection, what kind of monarch are you? Well, maybe we just now need to finally dissolve this whole monarchy, and this middle path of a constitutional monarchy needs to end. And they suspend it. They put the king on trial. They put Marie Antoinette on trial. And the long story short is that they will find them both guilty. And on January 21st, 1793, King Louis XVI is indeed executed. Here's an image of that moment. Not the first time in European history the king has lost his head, but certainly a very momentous one. Shortly thereafter, in this sort of back and forth between the push towards republic and the counter-revolutionary zeal, you have one of the leading instigators of all of this popular anti-monarchical ideology and pushing for a republic, Jean-Paul Marat, who was one of the great propagandists of the revolutionary side, and his newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people. He is actually assassinated in his bathtub by a counter-revolutionary Charlotte Corday in July of 1793. So shortly after, about 6 months after Louis is executed, this woman takes it into her own hands to slip in under the guise of she says I have a list of people that are plotting against the new Republican government, and Marat, allowed in as Marat is soaking. He has a skin disease, so he soaks quite often, and she stabs him with a small knife that she brought with her, a little stiletto. And then this is immortalized in Jacques-Louis David's Death of Marat painting, in which you can actually see that David draws on earlier representations of Christ being taken down from the cross, the deposition and entombment imagery of Jesus, sort of seeing Marat as kind of a martyr for this particular cause. And so begins shall we say, the Second Revolution. This is a more radical revolution. It's radicals aligned with the Jacobins, the push for the Republic. It's not led by the educated middle class lawyers and bankers and doctors. It's led by shopkeepers and artisans and factory workers and wage earners. And they want a very different France. They don't even want what these middle class folks want. They want something that works for all people, and they want a republic. The government, whether it has a king or not, has not addressed the rising bread prices and the falling value of the assignats and all the continuing economic calamity in France. And one group that really emerges that'll be a driving force over the next couple of years in the French Revolution will be these folks called the sans culottes, right? It literally means without knee pants. They didn't wear the short pants with then the silk stockings that go down the rest of the leg. They wore long trousers, right? They were average working people. They worked in the fish markets, and they worked as porters, and they worked in factories in France. They did not like the liberalism and economic freedom of the Enlightenment because they needed support. They needed price controls, and they needed, the government to intervene more in the economy to support them. So this whole capitalist experiment to them sounded like a great risk, that they would not be secure in their economic position. They needed more government benefits, guarantees in a sense. Um, they were suspicious of the middle class wealth and representative government. Um, and that brings them into contention with the Jacobins. But because the sans-culottes are motivated and they're out there on the streets and they're pushing hard against the government, many of the Jacobins sometimes feel that they have to go along with it because it's sort of the beginnings of mob rule, right? You have to kowtow to these because otherwise, they stormed the royal palace at the Tuileries and nearly took out Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette. They could do the same thing to the National Assembly. So you have to bow to these individuals, and they will be a major force in continually radicalizing the French Revolution. All right, that's enough for this little installment. So thank you for listening.